War II, as everybody knows, was a terrible time in human history, the history of mankind. It affected a lot of people in so many different ways. One of the things I always found interesting, though, is how people respond to the paranoia that comes along with war, and that a perfect example is the internment of German American. Did you know that during World War II, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were interned? I'm going to assume that the answer is yes. You probably did know that, because if you attended any American school, in junior high school and high school, it's required that the history teachers tell you about Japanese Americans being interned during World War II. I specifically was told that when I was in school. My children were being told that as well. But what I didn't know, what many of you probably don't know, is that 11,000 German Americans, actually over 11,000 German Americans, were also interned during World War II. People that were just taken from their homes, lost their possessions, had no time to pack. FBI just came up and knocked on their door. When the door was answered, they were just rustled up, arrested, and taken and put on a train, put on buses, army vehicles, shipped off to internment camps across the country. Many of them were actually shipped back to Germany at the end of the war. In some cases, were actually traded with Germany for prisoners on a prisoner exchange, and were sent back to Germany. I know a good friend that was sent back to Germany with his family. This is an American boy who was born in Brooklyn, New York. 12 years old, was sent back to Germany at the end of the war after being interned for several years in the United States with his brother, his mother, and his father, then sent back to Germany at the end of the war. War-torn Germany, completely devastated, and had to start their lives over in Germany. I don't understand why I wasn't told that. I don't understand why my children weren't taught that. In fact, this came to my attention as well when my 14-year-old son was in junior high school in Gilbert, Arizona. Brought his book home and said, "Dad, look at this part." And there was right inside the book. It said that the big problem with internment, essentially, was that the only people interned were Japanese Americans. No German Americans or Italian Americans were ever interned. That's not just false, it's an outright lie. There's FBI records. I've seen the records. German Americans and Italian Americans were interned during the war. Yet our educational system is requiring our teachers to use textbooks that say not only that that ignores the fact that German Americans and Italian Americans were interned, it comes out and actually denies that it even happened. It's not true, and to me that's an atrocity. You talk about making sure you understand history so you don't repeat it. All history keeps telling us is that Japanese Americans were interned. Now, I don't know why the fact that German Americans and Italian Americans were interned during the war are being completely ignored. I've seen several House resolutions in the United States government go and just die. Nobody wants to deal with it. Nobody wants to talk about it. The U.S. government has not acknowledged internment of German Americans. But they have tendered a formal apology to Japanese Americans and have enacted 11 different laws on their behalf. I don't understand that. I don't understand the hesitation for the U.S. government, my government, the government that I believe in, this country that I care so much about, that I believe in so much, refuses to acknowledge what they did. And when you talk to the victims of internment, not just Japanese Americans, but German Americans and Italian Americans, you talk to them, they're not angry and bitter that it happened. They, for the most part, understand that during war, these types of things happen during war, and as many of them said, this too shall pass. And they lived with the internment, and they did the best they could, and they understood that. But then to be told that it didn't happen to them, it's just a slap in the face. That's where I think the anger stems. That's where my anger stems. I understand the paranoia. I understand that after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, how Americans would probably be a little paranoid about the Japanese family living next door. I'm not saying it's right, but it's understood. I understand that. That's human nature. You know, we make a big deal today about what's going on down in Guantanamo Bay, holding people against their will without charging them. But nobody still, to this day, gives a darn about the German Americans and Italian Americans that were held against their will during World War II. Again, many of them sent back to Germany at the end of the war. It doesn't make sense to me. And many of these people that were affected this by, when they were 12 years old, they're now in their 70s. Many of them have passed away. They've gone to their grave without any kind of reconciliation with their own government. And I think it's high time that somebody step up and start writing their government, elected officials, and making a big deal of this. And at least just have somebody in the U.S. government make a formal apology for what had happened, not only to the Japanese Americans, but the German Americans and the Italian Americans as well. The story of my friend that compelled me to do the research and the studying. I traveled to Germany with a former internee and visited the prison in Hohenasperg, which is just outside the town of Ludwigsburg. This is a prison that he was held at when his family was deported back to Germany at the end of the war. This 12-year-old boy was sent to this prison in a cell by himself. It wasn't a prison that we know of today in the United States. This prison made Alcatraz look like an amusement park. This was a several centuries old citadel. It's an old, I wouldn't say castle, it was more of a fortress on the top of a very tall hill, complete with a moat around it, drawbridge, the whole 9 yards. And this 12-year-old boy was stuck in this prison without his parents, with nobody, while soldiers were screaming and calling him a little Nazi. This is a boy from Brooklyn, New York. He wasn't born in Germany and moved to Brooklyn. He was born in Brooklyn. He's an American citizen. This was an American citizen that was denied any type of rights or just decent human decency. And our government continues to refuse to acknowledge that this even happened. If you get a chance, I do highly recommend this book. It's called Prison Called Hohenasperg. It's been written by a man by the name Art Jacobs, who was interned with his family and sent back to Germany at the end of the war. It details the issues and the problems that they went through as a family, what happened to his family, and his struggle to come back to America, which eventually he did on his own, without his parents. Came back to the country that he loved. In fact, he was so in love with this country when he came back. He enlisted in the military and served 20 years in the Air Force. Retired to say that these people aren't bitter. They don't hate the United States of America. They're very proud. What they're upset about is the fact that the U.S. government refuses to acknowledge what it had done to their families. This man here, their family lost everything. I mean, not just furniture in their home and their possessions, but important things like family pictures. They were gone. They didn't have a chance to pack. They were told, when the FBI knocked on their door, they were told, pack up one suitcase of your clothes and let's go. They had 5 minutes. Everything is gone. Everything's lost. And I can understand the resentment, not because it happened, but because the U.S. government refuses to admit that it happened. And that is probably the only thing that embarrasses me about saying that I'm an American. During my research, I've come across a lot of manuscripts and stories of different people that were interned during the war.